Great. All right.
Welcome everyone to the future of mental and behavioral health. Welcome again, I should say. I'm one of your hosts, Bambi Francisco Roizen. This is certainly a surreal time, unprecedented time. It just took us an hour to quite a challenge. We're being isolated from our friends and families or losing work. Many of us have to deal with so many very different um, and and difficult challenges. So at the same time, slowing down is good for us. Some of us are doing things that we should probably have been doing more often, like sitting down with our family and having dinners, or cleaning out our homes versus buying more stuff to fill it. So it's a good time to be reflective, to be still, to think outside the box, to think outside ourselves. It's also a good time to be grateful. So is this time actually having a positive effect? Or are there just too many unknown questions that are overwhelming, such as how do I pay my bills? How do I keep my family healthy and busy? These are pressing questions, and we'd like to explore those questions with our panelists, many of whom are providing a lot of critical support to those in this period of social isolation. Before we do that, I'd like to bring in my co-host, Dr. Arshana Dubey, who has been on the front lines herself. So, Arshana.
Thank you, Bambi. Thank you for the panelists joining us for such an important conversation in such unprecedented times. I join here as a physician who still practices and then also sees patients, and we are experiencing quite a bit of physical and mental turmoil globally. And as we welcome our panelists, we would like to hear their wisdom and thoughts, how they are themselves meeting this challenge and how they're supporting the patients and the providers who are providing care at this time. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Mark, who is joining from UCSF Health Hub. Mark?
Hi, welcome from UCSF Health Hub. This is 2.0 version of this. So far, it looks like everyone needs to go to Zoom. Sorry, we're not in Mission Bay. Mission Bay would be a better place for all of us to be. This is a great program that Bambi and Ashna put together. Alex Morgan is one of our directors, so it's a treat to be able to experience Alex. And really, with no more ado, welcome on behalf of UCSF Health Hub.
Great, thank you, Mark. I also want to thank Avison Young, BetterHelp, StrapPoint, and Scrubbed, an advisor as well, for helping to support this series, this Invent Health series. So let's begin. I'd like to introduce our panelists: Alex Morgan from Coastal Ventures, Russell Glass at Ginger, Tim Blevins at United Healthcare Optum, and Alon Matas of Teladoc's Better Health. So to start with, just everyone introduce themselves and briefly mention how this coronavirus pandemic has affected your businesses.
So Alex?
So I'll go first. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm glad to see everyone, at least that I can see, seems to be doing well and keeping healthy and staying home and doing all the right things. So as a venture firm that's very active in healthcare and biotech, as well as with many companies, we are in general very busy right now interacting with a lot of our portfolio company CEOs to help them navigate changes to their business, changes to their operations, as well as anticipating future changes in the fundraising landscape in the months ahead. And so that will continue to be an issue of work for us. We are also actively looking at new investments. So we are still investing, and actually just did an investment, a small seed yesterday in a Y Combinator company. But I think one of the things that we're very proud of is, because of a a committed investment in diagnostics, telemedicine, drug discovery technology over the past several years, we actually have a number of companies particularly working on.
They don't have. They have. You don't have.
I think someone's talking to their kids. We have a number of companies working very specifically on COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, depending on which nomenclature you prefer, both in terms of developing new diagnostics technology, development of or working on drug repositioning, or development of new therapeutic approaches. And again, this is not the focus of today's session, but I mentioned that's we're very actively working as well in that capacity, as well in trying to support other companies not in our portfolio in their efforts to address the coronavirus epidemic. Certainly, and you'll hear from one of our outstanding companies in a second with Russ Glass, we are very happy to also be involved with and supporting a number of entrepreneurs working in care delivery in various forms, in telemedicine generally, but in particular relevant to this session in mental health in this very challenging and trying time where we have large numbers of people who have all kinds of stresses on their life and their activities, which is just sort of, I think, a normal state for anybody in this situation. And so I think it's for all that this is a scary and dangerous time, we have never in the past had this many tools and this amount of information to address the emerging and evolving threat, as well as all the tools that we have to enable people to receive care at home. And so I think we are certainly blessed and honored to be at this time where we actually can try to help all the people suffering in all kinds of different ways and will suffer in the months ahead. And so let me pause. I've spoken a lot there, but I wanted to, you asked what we're doing, and it's a lot, but I'm happy to answer particularly.
Definitely get to that. What about you, Russ?
Thanks for having me, Russ Glass, CEO of Ginger. I think we are seeing the uptick that you'd expect to see in terms of people that are struggling right now. We've seen about a 25% increase in therapy and psychiatry sessions over the last month. Interestingly, we're also seeing an intensity increase. So we measure the intensity of the conversations that we have, and intensity of conversation as rated by our providers is up about 11% over the last few weeks. So people are struggling. It's becoming more serious. And like Alex mentioned, I think we feel fortunate that we're in a position where we're a 60% remote company from a workforce standpoint. So it's kind of business as usual for us in terms of how we're operating, but for the occasional conference that doesn't work and the kids that will run back and forth through the background, I'm sure, during this. And on the other side, providing care virtually is what we do. It's all virtual care, and so being able to provide that to people when they're home right now feels like something we're grateful to be able to do.
Excellent, thank you. Ellen? Or Tim? Tim, you want to introduce?
Here we go.
Yeah.
His mic is not on.
I think it is.
Tim, is your mic on?
Your video is on, but I think you haven't joined the audio from the bottom. Again, scroll down on the bottom, and then on the leftmost, you may see a headphone, like an arrow. And if you join on that, you will be able to join through audio. And as you're on the phone?
Oh, he's on the phone.
Okay, let me find you somewhere in the phone universe, and then I will
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we can hear.
Okay, I think apparently everybody was muted on the phone, so that's okay. I'm here now. All right.
Perfect.
Hi, this is Tim Blevins. I'm Senior Vice President of Behavioral Health for Optum, and I'm also a licensed psychiatric social worker in the state of Connecticut, though I haven't practiced clinically for many years. And so I would say there are a few things that we're observing. The first one is that we have doubled the number of network clinicians in our network who have attested that they have the ability to provide secure virtual care for our members, and we have almost half that many that are kind of in the queue that we are processing right now. So, and the way we have sort of structured what we call virtual behavioral visits is that we went out to our network of providers, that would be psychiatrists, master's level clinicians, doctor level clinicians, and asked them to attest that they have the ability to provide care in a secure HIPAA compliant manner. And so when they do, and then we then audit that, then they become a subset of our network. So we're growing access in that way. The other thing is that many of our employer customers have asked us to waive any member financial liability for routine outpatient behavioral care, which we're very excited about. And candidly, I hope that they will do that for more than just the virtual care or the telephonic care or the other kinds of digitally supported care. But we'll see after this all passes. And then finally, we've seen a reduction in the number of people being admitted to psychiatric hospitals and facility-based care, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And in fact, I'm actually quite worried about it, because if there's any one group of people who you don't want to be isolating, because they tend to isolate anyway, it's patients who are compromised psychiatrically and may not leave their home to get their medication or to see their doctors and therapists. And this could result in people, again, not getting the care that they need and their conditions worsening. And so that's something that we're monitoring closely as well.
Excellent, thank you. And that's very positive that you are increasing your network, especially of virtual care. Alan?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Alon. I'm the founder and president of BetterHelp. We're an online counseling platform connecting people looking for mental health help with licensed therapists nationwide. We have a network of around 7,000 licensed therapists around the nation, and we do around 2 million counseling interactions every month. We provide counseling through text, phone, video, and chat. And during this outbreak, we definitely seen, like I mentioned before, a very significant uptick. The number of new members we have with concerns of stress and anxiety is double what we've seen the same period of last year. Same with existing members who have been in therapy maybe for months or years, are utilizing it much more, having more sessions and engagement with their therapists.
So my next question is for Alan and Russ and Tim. With regards to COVID-19, or the infamously known coronavirus, what are the main concerns that the therapists are experiencing on their during their sessions with the therapists? The patients are experiencing and they're sharing with the therapist. So maybe Russ, you could start off, and then Alan and Tim can chime in.
Sure. Yeah. So I think they're seeing what you'd expect in some ways. There's significant amount of financial stress, both actual layoffs, fear of layoffs, reduced pay, furlough concerns that are going on. Parenting is a big one right now. Dealing with homeschooling and childcare. Dealing with social distancing and not having childcare able to come during the day when you're.
But I think it's still a good idea, and it's
I love the support there. I think it's a good idea. doing more of my sessions, I think would be.
Yes, we purposefully did that. Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think there's an increase in panic attacks. So I think people are, the stress levels are up significantly. Fear of the unknown, isolation, as you'd expect from the forced isolation that's going on, and then sleep has become a problem that people are having. So we're seeing, and that of course leads to other things. When you're not sleeping as well, you have more trouble coping, and then that leads to less sleep. And so we're seeing that cycle increasingly over the past few weeks.
Yeah. Ellen?
Yeah, the usual suspects of stress and anxiety are definitely the ones we see shooting up the most, and more in proportion to what we typically see, which is a combination of stress and anxiety, but also specific things like grief counseling or eating disorders or things like that. Now it's a lot more around stress and anxiety, and also coming to depression. We also start seeing differences between different states based on where they are in this timeline of outbreak, where places where lockdowns or shelter in place or whatever you want to call it, earlier we start seeing more around isolation, in a little bit of depression. In other places it's just building up towards that, a lot more about anxiety, like Russ mentioned, either financial or just how all this is going to end eventually.
Tim?
Yeah, I would say we're seeing a bit more engagement in various cohorts that we haven't up to this point. So relationship issues are front and center right now in a big way. And, it's probably the former family therapist in me or the glass half full person that I am or whatever, but I'm convinced that it actually is going to bring families and people closer just in general, by hook or by crook. And I think that's a really good thing. But we're seeing some of our therapists doing more couples therapy and family therapy virtually, which is exciting. We're seeing people with eating disorders and the family work that can be done with them. And then families with children with special needs, particularly parents. And so those are some of the groups that we're seeing, in addition to the other groups that have already been mentioned.
And are your teams also geared towards, and it's sad and possibly the reality, towards grief counseling? And that's something that does become a reality as, family members have a loss in the family, or a friend or their family has a loss, and that kind of has a direct impact. And then the second part of the question is that panic attacks, because they do land up in the emergency room. Are you gearing your teams up for having to address panic attacks ahead of time with your digital tools so that people do not end up going to the emergency room and getting exposed to COVID-19? Are you creating specific programs geared towards that?
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
Anxiety and fear and either the impact of actual loss or perceived potential loss. There is a heightened sense of sort of anticipatory something. People don't know what. Like, will I have loss? Will I have significant financial loss, job loss of family members? So yeah, just in general, that's the beautiful thing about cognitive behavioral therapy, right? I mean, it must be adhered to in a highly protocolized way. So that we are doing across the board, and training and retraining all of our clinicians on the importance of that, as well as consistent data collection to be able to show outcomes. So those are a couple of the things, but yeah, with a specific focus on panic or the potential for it. Yeah.
Excellent.
I guess to add on to Arshana's question, I guess it's more of there's standard protocols for all of the different conditions that you mentioned that the patients are going to for, whether it's parenting issues or couples relationship issues. But are you also arming your therapist with some sort of standard protocol for what is going on, sort of underlying all of these different stressors? It's basically sort of do you have a protocol for these acts of God situations? Are you training them for that?
We, in the Ginger case, the therapists that we bring on and the psychiatrists and coaches, we rely on a lot of their core understanding and education and backgrounds, evidence-based care to continue. We're augmenting, though, with information, resources that we're building for this specific time. So we're trying to make sure that they have content available to them, they have resources available to them. We have a panel of experts that will write content, and we'll push that out so that as they're seeing these things, they have resources that we have written, approved, and can give them additional capacity to handle some of the things we're seeing out there right now. And frankly, we have to understand all of these people are also going through the same thing. So just because you're a care provider doesn't mean that you're not having the same issues that all the people you're working with are. So this content, the things that we're doing is also to help our own people feel good about where they are, and in turn give them the capacity to help others in a more effective way.
I think it's important to bear in mind that while this is a unique situation in terms of how many people are being impacted, the situation itself on a personal level is not something that is unique to why people go to therapy to begin with. So therapists should be able to deal with stress and anxiety and even fear of loss or things that are happening now. People have fear of loss in their life, and that did not start in February of 2020. So the difference really is now the mass of people. We don't feel like we need to educate therapists of how to deal with situations of stress and anxiety or some depression. Hopefully they already know by now that because they treated hundreds of thousands of people. Just now the demand is higher and it happens on a global level, which is the overwhelming part. But on the protocol of treatment and the way people are being treated and what are the methods and ways that therapists work with the clients on these kind of issues, they are already equipped with the tools to do that.
Well, but the couple of things that do get impacted, they do impact current scenario is the nonstop news cycle through all sources, and then also loss of support, personal support that people might have because of the social distancing or their friends and family network that they lean on, besides leaning on their therapist, that may be broken because of sickness or lack of or actually having shelter in place. So those are other things that, are you addressing access or increasing access to patients? That, that is what the other question was kind of related to this. How are you making your presence fill in that void that the friends and family network may not be able to fill in today?
Again, I mean, from our standpoint, a lot of what we talk about when we talk about resources, it is augmenting what people are trained to do for this specific situation, right? So for example, how do you manage social isolation? What are the habits you should form to help take care of yourself during this period of social isolation? How do you manage talking to a child about what's going on here and the fact that they're not going to school anymore, and they're in a very different situation than they were in before? How do you manage the fear of loss and grief in such a scalable way, right? Many of us are dealing with parents who are in very high risk situations, let alone other loved ones that might have comorbidities that put them in a higher risk situation. So all of this hitting at once is something that, you know, having additional resource for is critical. And we're trying to get it out as broadly as possible. So we're actually publishing beyond just our members so that the public has access to these. We're trying to make this service available for free to frontline healthcare workers who are really on the front lines of this. We're trying to help enterprises by removing annual contract lengths so they can just get up and running and not worry about what the long term is going to look like, because nobody actually knows. So just trying to change standard course of business as much as possible to get these resources out there and make sure that people are able to take advantage of them.
Great.
Not to.
Can I add one thing? So I heard from Patrice Harris yesterday, who's a psychiatrist and head of the AMA, and she had a great point that social distancing is not a great way to refer to this whole process, and that physical distancing is the thing that we want to stress, and that social distancing is the opposite of what we should try to achieve, and people should lean into social contacts, and we should encourage and support that. No, sorry, you know, it's like a minor thing about phrasing, but I actually think the sentiment is really important in these times, and particularly in sort of the topic of this conversation, that we make sure that we are encouraging social contact, but only discouraging physical or increasing physical distancing, because that's sort of, you know, again, and this is amplifying things that have been said in a different way, is that's how social distancing is how our society chooses to punish the worst offenders of the social contract, right? You put people in prison and solitary confinement. And so we should make sure that we're not trying to do that and make that very clear.
Oh, that's a great point, Alex. I think phrasing the right word is an important aspect, because, you know, people can still use a platform like Zoom to still have social interactions and be still physically distant. I have a few.
No social distancing in my house. But, you know, on that point, Alex, and to everyone else, and something that Tim mentioned, which is you're a glass half full type of guy, which is great, and this will bring everyone together. So, you know, therapy sessions, coaching sessions, they're kind of a luxury, right? They're not considered a staple. But at this time, you see a lot more people meditating, you see a lot more people praying. And for those who do meditate and pray, it's actually a part of their life. It is something that they do. They wake up in the morning, they pray, they brush their teeth. It is part of their life. Do you see this as sort of having your coach, having your therapist? Do you see that as becoming more of sort of a daily routine, as people realize that, you know, it's kind of good to talk to somebody and maybe not your family member?
Yeah, so our model is a little bit unique, and I think it facilitates part of it. In our model, what a member gets is an ongoing communication with a therapist through messaging, which is a little bit like email, which means I can send a message to my therapist anytime I feel like. I don't need to schedule anything, and typically get a response same day or day after. And then you have the weekly live session over phone or video or instant messaging, which is more of the traditional model. So you can have both the ongoing communication that can go up and down based on the need, and then also the regular rhythm. And what that leads to now is actually more communication through the messaging, where people can use more or less as they need. And now obviously it's a big need, and we see a big jump in that. So that's maybe more of an habitual. I don't think we want to make it like a habit of an hour session with a therapist every day. I don't think that's good clinically or practical and feasible. But having this resource that is always available and can always send a message to my therapist, even just to feel that I'm being heard, especially the time of isolation and disconnect from the regular support system, I think that's very, very powerful.
On that note, are you seeing as the rules and regulations change now, going across state borders? Are you starting to see that you're expanding your virtual care or your sessions or text text ability across the borders? And this is a question for all three providers at this time.
Yeah, it's Tim. I'm happy to start. I think it's a little too early to know. I mean, we were actually already seeing a lot of psychiatrists in particular who were doing a lot of work virtually get licensed in other states. And so I expect that we will start to see that. We'll see more of it. So that was already a trend that we were seeing. And now this just kind of opens this up. And it's a really good thing. I mean, it's not been such a challenge for psychiatrists, but it's been a huge challenge for other mental health therapists because the cost and the paperwork and all of that stuff. I have a home in Rhode Island and, was starting to do some clinical work a few years ago. And the licensing requirement meant that I needed to go back and find my clinical supervisor from more than 30 years ago, who I'm sure has long retired and I don't even know where she is. Like, I don't know how I was going to do that. So, I mean, I would have figured something out, but that's been really onerous for clinicians and the cost. I mean, it's not inexpensive so I think we'll see it, but it's a little early days.
Well, because there is an emergency directive that has come from all state boards right now, most all state boards, I think 5 excluded, that are opening up the borders for 90 days or 120 days for therapists to work across most states. So is that something that you are also seeing in behavioral health?
Oh yeah, it's in place across the board for medical providers and behavioral providers. So it's the same opportunity. And I think what they're going to see is that, all of the states, all the licensing requirements of all the states is almost exactly the same. So now I do understand that it's more difficult when you run into quality concerns. That's going to be a concern. There's no doubt about that. But that's not insurmountable. So yes, it's for all disciplines.
And is it positive for Ginger and BetterHelp that the borders are opening up in a way?
Yeah, I mean, from our standpoint, we've structured our business to operate within the 50-state issue, right? So our average therapist will have 7 state licenses. We take care of relicensing for them. So we're supply-demand matching across state lines anyway. However, if you look at the cost in our business of doing that, it's expensive and it takes resource away from actually providing care and actually delivering the value that we want to deliver to customers. So the easier this gets over time and the reduction of resource that we need to put towards these state licensing requirements, it's a win for not only us, but for the people we're caring for, right? We'll manage the quality and let's get rid of the regulations so that we can deliver great quality across all state lines.
I think there's, I'm going to take a more pessimistic approach here. I think there is a big gap between the walk and the talk. The president say it's emergency, we have to open up. In reality, almost nothing happens. And that's the situation right now. So if you're a licensed therapist in Nevada, at this point, you cannot provide services in California. You just cannot. And if you go and try to transition your license from Nevada to California, it will take somewhere between 6 months to 2 years. Nobody's going to do that. The issue of cross state line comes up again and again. Every time there is a crisis, there was the thing in Florida with the school shooting. Every time there is a big declaration of, yes, we know we need to figure this out. It doesn't make sense. We need more mental health care, not just in these kind of times, but there's a shortage all the time. And this can definitely be almost a magical solution. But when it trickles down to the boards, to the state boards, to the MFT boards, to the LPC boards, to the clinical social workers board, to the psychologist board, somehow it gets stuck. In a part of initiative, I think it's called SciAct, of the 9 states are trying to make kind of a cross-border thing. The reality, even now, even when we're in the middle of this emergency and crisis, is that if a therapist is not licensed in the state of the client, they cannot provide services to that point.
Alex, what are your thoughts? It sounds like Alon thinks it's not really going to be realistic to be able to have these open borders, but it does seem like that is potentially the future. That seems like that could be helpful not only for the providers, but the patients as well. Are you more optimistic about getting to that point where we do have open borders?
I am. I think regulation and licensing is one component. Probably even more important will be lowering barriers to reimbursement for remote care. And because we can, to Russ's point, we can sort of solve the supply side with some cost, but if you can't get paid at all, then you can't operate remotely. So I think that will be, so stepping back, we are in a once in a century situation, right? Nothing like this has been, has occurred since the Spanish flu pandemic. But we likely will emerge from this with a number of improvements in our healthcare system and in our world in general. It may be very hard to reintroduce these barriers once people have seen what is actually possible, whether that's relaxation of a lot of requirements through channel of telemedicine interaction. So waiving HIPAA requirements so people can get access through different channels. I think it may be, now that one, I don't know what will happen there, but I think in general, we will move towards a situation with much more increased fluidity in care delivery model, because it'll be very hard to step back. An example where we've seen this is in the ride sharing companies, where many groups lobbied, essentially the guilds of taxi providers tried to argue to protect their monopoly of service providing. The fact that the majority of the public find the ease of access to those services so incredibly powerful and so useful, that has basically preempted special interest groups, and barriers to their operation have gone down, and it'll be just been very hard. These companies like Uber took a chance to say, we'll just try to show that this has enough value. And again, it's hard to predict exactly what will happen, but in general, I'm optimistic. An example I would say from the recent past is where things have really improved in the face of an epidemic. If you look at standards of care or practices of care in bloodborne pathogens prior to AIDS and HIV, people just, providers in trauma cases just often did not wear gloves. People would do all kinds of care maneuvers that now would be unthinkable. It's now not, HIV and AIDS transmission is thankfully, less of a concern than it was, although it's still a concern. But all of sort of medicine have really instituted much better procedures, and we're never going to walk back from that. And so overall, I'm optimistic. I wouldn't say I would place strong bets about any one particular aspect, but I think overall I'm optimistic, and I think we will have much increased mechanisms of remote care delivery and ways to pay for it.
Yeah, but we have to remember that there are 200 regulatory bodies, like around 4 per state on mental health. And we're a month into this crisis, and not even one of them said, yes, I'm allowing therapists from other states to work with people in my state. And they all have the power. They could all done this, and none of the 200 has done this so far, and we're a month in.
Yeah, so
that's why you're talking about what's going to happen after and how things will stick. But even now, when we're in this crisis,
so I'll give an example. So this isn't maybe one that has positive valence for a lot of people, but 9/11 gave us TSA, which has an operating budget nearly $8 billion a year. And so we can argue about whether that's a net positive or a net negative on society, but there was a huge shift in the way that people travel as kind of an outcome of a disaster, an event that prompted change. And so I think significant change is possible and likely to happen. And it's somewhat in the face of demand by the public. So again, these are special interest groups at the end of the day that want to block labor liquidity or labor fluidity. And they have, in general, special interest groups have more time on their hands to lobby for what they're trying to do. But when public as a whole feels that something is possible and sees what's possible and has demand, those barriers fall. And so I think, unlike, for example, some of the regulations around travel that people can sort of debate how valuable it is, certainly improving access to care and reducing barriers will be something that has a net social positive benefit, as well as basically lifestyle and care procedures that reduce virus transmission will have clearly a net positive economic and social benefit, even in future epidemics, whether they're flu or even there are other forms of coronavirus, right? Like 10 to 15% of colds are caused by, coronavirus, and mostly rhinovirus. But reducing transmission of things that we don't think about, we think about as fairly benign, actually have massive economic and social impact. And I think structural behavior changes that enable people to work from home, seek care remotely. So if you have a cold, you have a respiratory infection, and we create lower barriers for you getting care in your home and not going to a provider, not getting other people sick in the waiting room, I think those are social and care delivery changes that will come, and they will be a net long-term benefit for everyone. Sorry, I'm drifting pretty far from a question about licensure because I don't know exactly. I can't predict what will happen, but I think overall it will be improvement.
I think you're both right. It's going to take longer than you think, and it's going to happen. But it's a morass right now. The state compacts that have come together are wildly helpful. So there is precedent for some of this, and the sort of 15, 17 states that have come together and said, look, we're going to follow the same rules and we're going to use the same licensure. I think as that, there's a model for this if the rest of the states can get on board. California, unfortunately, is one of the most brutal in terms of how they view this.
Well, and I want to kind of second that, and I do want to say that we will possibly, I'm more positive about this change happening a lot sooner than we imagine, simply because what Alex is saying too. So we brought these changes upon, and I shared that document with everyone. Each of the states are opening up their borders, most of them, and it's because of the pain point. The hospital systems cannot bear the demand that we would have today. So by opening up the borders, we are pulling in providers, and the healthcare providers, especially the doctors at this time, will help to take the load off of the hospitals. And it is starting from a pain point perspective, but it is going to eventually become a convenience thing for folks to be able to have access 24/7, and regardless of which state they're sitting, and take people away from going to the hospital or brick and mortar and will get care. And I know Teladoc didn't have much traction, but they were starting to see more. And as the trusted source of care would become available across borders, I think people will end up start to use that as first point of care. So hopefully sooner.
Yeah, well, again, I think people are, telehealth in general will never go back, right? Telehealth was widely available, but very few people used it. They're going to realize how convenient it is. And I think there will be a shift there in terms of utilization patterns, which will then lead to changes downstream.
Yeah.
But for this emergency period, I think it's going to take some time. That's just how our system works. It doesn't move very quickly outside of emergencies. But I have to drop off. I apologize. Tori Barnes is here and is going to take over on Ginger related questions. She heads up comms for us. She's outstanding. But thank you so much for having me, and look forward to future Zoom
Adventures.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.
Thanks.
Yeah. Take care.
Yes, we were supposed to end at 4:30, so it's understandable if anybody else has to drop off. Okay, we'll try to keep this until 5, and maybe what we should do is, people have been asking questions already, I believe, or at least raised their hands, so we can also open it up. And so we can end this at 5 and then maybe open it up as well. But Tim, I guess you're leaving?
I do. I have to go. Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It's been quite a pleasure. Thank you. See you. Take care. Be in touch.
So, so Russ was talking about utilization, but I was going to ask Russ as well as Tim about utilization, but now they're both off the line. But so, a question for you, Alex. Now that sounds that you're very optimistic, and I'm sure all of us are. We try to finance or invent the future. But what are you seeing at this time? Are you seeing that this pandemic, is it paralyzing or is it mobilizing? Are you starting to see people just come up with all sorts of ideas, or are they just unable to, do they need more time to think about, grasp what's happening? And
Yeah,
mainly
so
about the entrepreneurs.
yeah, so I think so. I have a very biased view of the world from where I sit, in that we're getting a huge number of proposals from people who have interesting ideas on how to respond to coronavirus in particular, or various things related to the current epidemic, et cetera. So I certainly feel like I'm seeing a lot of creativity. And as I mentioned, a number of our portfolio companies that might have been doing slightly different things have focused now on, many of them have focused on how to address issues with the pandemic. Some very directly, for example, changing their molecular diagnostics technology to be relevant, or scaling up their robotic operation that can do improve throughput of testing, or focusing their drug discovery pipeline on coronavirus, for example. And so I guess I'm somewhat biased, and I see a huge amount of people actively working and being quite imaginative. I think certainly entrepreneurs skew towards optimistic, or they wouldn't be entrepreneurs. So again, it's a biased sampling of the world. And certainly they are people that tend to be very creative. So, I think we're seeing a huge amount of activity. I'm seeing a huge amount of activity. I think there are a lot of advantages to small companies now, in that it's kind of the small vehicle analogy. They don't have a lot of mass to shift operation. And so they're able to break and accelerate very quickly in a different direction, in the way some of the larger enterprises may have a harder time. Now, the flip side is many very large enterprises and entities that we work with in diagnostics and therapeutics and care delivery, et cetera, are making adjustments, and it's amazing how fast they are moving. So I'm giving you a long answer, but I'm certainly seeing a lot of stuff. I think there are a handful of companies, so a lot of positive activity and a lot of creativity. I think there are a lot of companies that their entire business model was associated with things like travel, hospitality, or supporting small, medium businesses that had a retail or in-person presence. And many of those groups really have to rethink what they're doing and restructure. And again, we have many creative people who are coming up with interesting ways to change whatever business they were in before that might have been reliant on in-person operations to a remote operational paradigm. And so I'm constantly being amazed by a company that I would have thought, well, this is it. This is the way your business operates, figuring out a way that they can contribute and add value in some new and clever way.
On the lines of innovation, are you seeing utilization of technology, especially with the behavioral health model, starting to utilize more of intelligence or learning? And this is a question for all the other two participants, panelists here, and also utilizing of automated kind of coaches or digital coaches in a way.
I can speak for Ginger on this one on Russ's behalf.
Mm-hmm.
Because of our integrated system and the way our model works, backed by AI, we're able to balance that supply and demand and our workload on our coaches and therapists and psychiatrists to allow us to be a little bit more creative and nimble. So one of the things we rolled out this week was free access for all U.S. healthcare frontline workers to our mental health coaching system, which we wouldn't be able to do if we weren't able to balance traditional caseload. We're also waiving our 1-year commitment for new employer clients to come on board, creating a free resource center for the public. All things we wouldn't typically do, in the midst of normal business, but because we're able to balance our provider workload and really scale, we've been able to get pretty creative.
Excellent. Elon, are you using any art intelligence or digital bots or other things that are utilized to scale your operations?
So the short answer is no, but it can be a bit longer than that. So our approach was really not to disrupt therapy. It's not let's invent AI bot type of therapy, but to take the tried and true science of 100 years and change the access to the therapy. So it's the same therapist, same model, same type of service that people expect when they go and sit on a therapist's couch in a brick and mortar place, just delivered in a more convenient, accessible and affordable way. And that's been a theme all along. That doesn't mean that we don't use digital tools as well, but they're all initiated and administered by the therapist. So the therapist can use a digital worksheets of a therapist think that you may experience social anxiety. They will start a path with you or send you a digital worksheet for social anxiety, but it's not a self-help module or a path of that sort. I'm not saying there isn't a room for these kind of tools, but I think there is a very clear distinction between clinical service provided by clinicians and therapists to self-help tools, whether it's meditation or sometimes coaching or AI that have different benefits and definitely can be useful, but not to be confused with one another. In terms of the supply, I think this is coming also from kind of a concern about supply. A lot more people need therapy now. Do we have enough therapists? Can we provide this? So one of the, from all the terrible things that happen, one of the better things is that actually we have definitely more demand, but also more supply. Because a lot of therapists are now also at home, whether they worked at schools or in agencies or in other settings. And now they're also looking to work online. The number of applications we get of therapists who want to work with us tripled over the last couple of weeks. And also therapists who historically has been working with us just a few hours a week and now opening their availability to be much more than that, sometimes the equivalent of full time. So unlike doctors maybe where it's kind of finite, in our case, we definitely see a lot more supply that can answer to the demand. So I wouldn't rush to let's automate everything and replace therapists with bots and AI.
Hey, Arshana, if I can jump in here, I want to echo some of what Alex says. Look, the genie is out of the bottle with telehealth. What's happened? If you look at anything that the virus has done, it's telehealth is going to dramatically change how doctors work, work with their patients. We're seeing this at UCSF. It's going to be dramatic. Could be 60, 70% of patient visits are going to go away, and everything is going to move to telehealth, probably in the next 2 or 3 years. I got involved with a company called NeuroFlow that has basically building workflow around telehealth. So the whole idea is how can clinicians, how can care teams support more patients with the same amount of time? And it's combining workflow with telehealth. So I think there's a lot of ways that this is going to get resolved, and it's exciting.
And I totally agree. I think the genie is out of the bottle at this time. Most of my peers are doing about 80% of the visits that they would do in their offices are doing virtual. And if you do a really good history, and Alex, you could kind of comment on that, but if you do actually do a good history, you are pretty accurate on your diagnoses, about more than upwards of 80% of the time. We see that at Stanford. We see that in most of the teaching institutes where we teach students to do better history than putting hands on the patient.
So I want to sort of go back to what Alon sort of talked about, which was sort of the supply. Actually, everyone touched on it, and the therapists, and for Victoria, the coaches, because I think you make it both with coaches or you have coaches on the front line. So what qualifications what are the minimum qualifications for a therapist and a coach? And what can they actually support? What kind of conditions can they support before you have to sort of, it sounded like everyone was talking about a number of the members or patients are starting to have some serious conditions. So can your therapist and coaches support them? And then what do you do when they have to move off your service? Do you have a partnership, say, or referral to psychiatrists? Sorry, that's a number of questions there, but I guess minimum, what's the minimum requirement? What do you require of your coaches and your therapists?
Sure, it's a great question, and so pivotal to balancing the supply and demand problem that already existed in behavioral health that is just now exacerbated. So for us, coaches are a pivotal piece of the model. They are 200 hours certified with Ginger, so they go through our own training. Typically, master's level psychology programs they often come from are at Duke and Columbia. We see a lot of. And there is recently, behavioral health coaching was certified as a CPT code, so it's now reimbursable. But for us, they are certified with us at Ginger, and they deal with really day-to-day stress and anxiety. They're trained in motivational interviewing. They're trained in how to text and writing training, because it's certainly a different modality of care versus face-to-face. And then when coaches or a member feel that they need to be escalated, and or our technology is seeing certain words and phrases come up frequently, then we bring in a therapist or psychiatrist into their care team. So the coach stays with the member longitudinally to help them with exercises, on the side to be doing their homework, to making sure that they have continuity of care. So it really becomes more of a care team approach. And we find that tremendously effective, so much so that 90% of our members' needs are actually met in coaching alone. And then, of course, again, if they need to go up into therapy or psychiatry, we make that happen and keep the coach with them.
So is it fair to say that the majority of your utilization would be sort of mild anxiety and sort of more, if you think of the spectrum, it's just, but anxiety and stress and nothing too serious?
Yeah, it is. It's totally fair to say 90% of our members' needs are met at that coaching level. But again, if they do end up needing to be escalated, then we certainly deal with it there.
What about you, Alon? Where is the utilization for BetterHelp?
So we took maybe a more simple approach. All our providers are licensed therapists. We don't have coaches. They're all LPC, LCSWs, MFDs, or PsyDs. They're all post internship. They're not under supervision. They all have at least 3 years of experience and 3,000 clinical hours. And remember, what we try to do is to replicate the therapist model, where you go and to brick and mortar. And when you go to see a therapist, you don't expect the therapist to tell you, yes, I'll work with you, but here is also a coach. And there is a whole care team. It's you and the therapist, and that's your expectation. And we try to provide the same type of experience, again, just with a different access model. So in our case, they're all licensed therapists with different expertise. So we have therapists who are experts in different things and sometimes very specific niches, but they're all licensed therapists. There are cases that people need to be referred out or augmented with other resources. Once an hour, of course, is when medication is needed, and then there are referrals to psychiatrists. But also sometimes just the online modality is not a good fit, and then there is a referral to a face-to-face local therapist. And another option, of course, this sometimes happens, that it's becoming kind of a crisis situation that is beyond what you want or can deal on an asynchronous basis or a weekly meeting. Then beyond the typical protocols, we also have a partnership with a company called Crisis Text Line. It's a nonprofit with thousands of volunteers that can help people in a crisis time kind of elevate their immediate needs and stressors, and also make an emergency call if needed. But the model, again, is very simple. Licensed therapists, the same therapists that work in traditional in-office.
So there is an audience question related to that, Helen. Are you exploring virtual community platforms in addition to the one-on-one therapy to address, underlying issues of loneliness?
Yeah, so we have something called the groupinars, which is a combination of group sessions and a webinar, where people with common issues or common underlying conditions can talk with each other, kind of a group session that is moderated and led by a therapist. We have 25 of them in different topics. We now launched a new one that is specifically around concerns that are related to the COVID-19 situation, and it's definitely very popular with tens and hundreds of participants on each webinar. We're trying to make them almost daily. So to have some interpersonal interactions, but most of the time it's a one-on-one therapist-client interaction. This is the core of what we provide.
Another question from the audience, it's for everyone. Are membership-based payment business models becoming more prevalent in this space, just like we're seeing direct primary care, like One Medical, Crossover, and other companies? And are we seeing, with that, will we see deeper patient-provider relationships and less reimbursement challenges that Alex was mentioning about reimbursement, or Telly? Are we seeing those models or business models more membership-based, or is it still fee-for-service?
So from our point of view, the model was always a membership model, and it's mostly direct to consumer. So the typical model, a consumer would pay a little over $200 a month to have the ongoing communication with a therapist over messaging, and then the weekly live session. It has always been this way for close to 6 years. It's a membership model with a flat fee. It's deliberately not per session because it's part of the theme of having a resource that is available to you. And I think what we've proven is that even when you take insurance and reimbursement and the employer and payer out of the equation, still, if the product and the services are strong enough, you can definitely build a direct-to-consumer offering. We also work with businesses and universities and payers and employers, but the vast majority of our business is direct to consumers with self.
Okay.
And our business at Ginger is B2B, so different model, but it is subscription based. So employers are our primary our buyer, and they pay a per employee per month typically. Therapy and psychiatry are reimbursed at fee for service. On occasion, we're starting to see more demand from employers in purchasing a subscription with a flat rate for a certain number of therapy and psychiatry sessions. So this is certainly on the rise, and I think we're seeing that across the landscape as well.
And an additional question for you, Victoria, that do you do drives for employers, which are kind of proactive drives, especially post-crises or mid-crises as we speak? Do you run those kinds of drives within an organization or enterprise?
Drives as in marketing campaigns to that they're
more kind of group therapy sessions or group sessions post crises, if there's gun violence or COVID right now, things like that. That's an audience question at this point.
Great question. We partner with an organization called R3 Continuum to do critical incident response for any sort of situation as you described.
And Alex, are you seeing models that are more membership based in your behavioral health portfolio, or are they more fee for service?
There is, I think, in general, a drift toward, and I guess I'll probably speak more generally into various kinds of employer care delivery models. That there is more of a shift to membership-based payments, and I think there are good incentives that can be baked in there, where the enterprise providing the service is really incentivized to improve outcome and provide that service in the most capital efficient way as possible, and not just try to increase demand for their service. Obviously, for some kinds of behavioral health, engagement improves out whatever another outcome measurement. But I think that is in general a shift. I guess, to be also transparent, there's a shift between general trends and then talking most immediately about the current situation we've been in the last few months. There is a lot of, I think, hesitation. So obviously most age Americans get their care paid for through an employer. There has been, I think, a shift or a pause executing on starting up some of these employee benefits within the past few months, because a lot of enterprises are concerned about actual operating and plummeting market cap, etc., and looking into potential layoffs. So I think it'd be a near-term challenge to see how this all sorts out. But it's also a space where it's very clearly something that companies that have large numbers of employees should be actively trying to acquire these technologies. It's in their best interest, even though they may be concerned about expenditures near term. This is probably one of the better long-term investments they can make right now. I think, again, any B2B situation, the culture of the second part of that relationship really determines what's possible. And you have a lot of uncertainty in a lot of boardrooms all over the world. So I don't know if I can predict what will happen near term in payment models from enterprise.
So Alex, you brought up a good point regarding outcomes. And Alon and Victoria, how are you measuring outcomes?
Yeah, so we take a look at PHQ-9 and GAD-7 scores regularly through the app, and they're done through conversation. We certainly don't believe when you're feeling sick or down that you should need to fill out forms. So we're measuring those constantly to look at effectiveness.
So, but 90% of your members sort of interact with coaches, right? So to a great extent, they're not really going to measure too high on those PHQ-9 and GAD tests, right? Because that's really going to screen you for depression. So are there other ways that you are monitoring them? And if not, that's fine. But
of course, yeah, I know. So I mean, anecdotal feedback and analysis of the chat transcripts to the extent we can, and then looking at aggregate themes, of course, while protecting patient privacy.
Sure. So we look at it obviously on a client basis, but also on a therapist basis, because we want to assess the quality of the therapist and always try to improve the network and spot issues. So we're very incentivized to track outcomes. But also a pretty big study that one of the main components of the study was actually UCSF. It's was supposed to host us, but it's all Zoom now. Actually initiated it on specifically the reduction of depression symptoms, and compared people who have gone through BetterHelp for 3 months compared to people who went to face-to-face therapy, and saw either similar or sometimes even better reduction of depression symptoms based on PHQ-9 after 3 months. So it's definitely not just anecdotal. It's not just people tell us how great everything is, but it's also proven clinically with the standards ways that these things are being measured.
Any other questions, Arshana, from the audience?
You're on mute.
Arshana, you're on mute.
Yes, I was on mute. So those are the questions that were from the audience, but I would urge audience to start asking questions. And you have a chat box that's on the bottom if you scroll down, and please type away. And we could start posing the questions. I know, Bambi, you had pressing questions regarding how to take care of kids, especially when they are socially distancing and consuming social media. And if you do have modules that you are utilizing to help address that.
Yeah, so we launched a year ago a service called Teen Counseling, which is for kids 13 to 17-year-old with parental consent and parental improvement. parents also involved. But it's a service that is geared specifically for teens, and obviously it's a great match for teens, not just in crisis situations, but every day I have a 14-year-old. I can take everything from her, but not her phone. So her ability to text her therapist is probably something that is much more valuable than the option to go somewhere she can drive and someone. So it's really a great service for teens, and we've seen a huge uptick of usage of that and great outcomes for the teen service. I think it's too early to tell about this specific situation, how teens coping with it compared to adults, and what would this social isolation do. They might actually be more adapt to it than we are because they're already so much connected. So they actually might prevail on this compared to us adults.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
no, I would love to hear some advice from some of the parents out there regarding social media, which doesn't appear to, provide any structure at all for my kids, but it definitely provides a lot of communication and connection. So there's a trade-off there. So we limit our time. I believe it's a good time for them to be still and not even talk to their therapist, like actually just be still. But I would love to hear from others about their relationship with social media and their thoughts on the benefits and the downside. Mark, you have a lot of teenagers, or you have a couple
Yeah,
at least.
well, the answer is there's no victory here. When you have, right now we all have, I have three kids at home, all basically at different schools, all learning different, all on different, programs, and it's insane. But let's take a step back. I think that, the more you limit it, the more basically it just comes down to the cat and mouse game. And so, our approach is basically just give them, they have 16 hours of which they can basically not do things in 8 hours where they can. And that's as best as we've been able to figure it out.
And yeah, and with my teenager, we are exactly doing what Mark said, and somewhat kind of stepping back as humans of our generation and looking at this is going to be the reality of how the kids and the next generation socializes. We do differently, and we have more human-to-human connection, whether it's what Alex said, not social distancing, physical distancing. So be social. But for kids, it is digital, and that creates a sense of belonging. And so it is a double-edged sword. It works for them and it's belonging, and it can isolate them because if there is some level of bullying or other things that are happening, and it's happening in isolation because nobody can witness it. So it's a healthy balance and constant steering the compass for kids that we as parents have to do.
Well, I think Arshan should be cognizant of the time. It's 5:05. I know we started at 3:30, or we were supposed to start at 3:30. We ended up starting at about 4:15. But that is quite a long time. And I'm not quite sure if people are raising their hands, but I do want to respect everyone's time. We are going to have another virtual conference on April 22nd, and then we'll continue to do so May 6th, and hopefully May 27th, we will actually have our live event at UCSF, but we will see. And I appreciate everyone's patience and everyone's time. And my parting words is that I think this is a time that we can obviously remain vigilant about others and how we can be productive, but I think it's also a great time to be present and consider the important things in life that we often neglect. I'm certainly doing that with my time.
Yeah, and I would second that. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining from home. It is not live, but these other times. I do also want to add on help others. I think that's something that we can do in our community. We have, mixed population of like high risk individuals that live as our neighbors, dear neighbors. One of the ideas, Bambi, that you were asking about teenagers. So my son has created a flyer that he has given out to all of our neighbors to help out with grocery or pharmacy visits. If he is young, he can go do that for them and help folks who are 60 plus and save them not to go to grocery and pharmacy. If you can, you have those able-bodied folks to help them to help out the neighbor, and that would be helpful. Thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate it. And keep safe.
Great job, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.